Good morning and welcome to Deepwater Baptist Church Online. Today is Valentine's Day, a time of the year when usually the card shops and the florists are very busy and eating out usually costs twice as much as normal. This year, of course, things are a little different. I guess that this year it's deliveries from Moonpig and Interflora, with the meal out being replaced with a home-cooked meal or a takeaway from Just Eat perhaps. But whatever you're doing today, I hope that today you're feeling loved. Love is a really important theme in the Bible. In fact, the Bible itself has been described as a love story. It's the story of God's great love for us. And even if you don't go to church regularly, I'm sure you've heard some of the famous verses in the Bible that talk about love. At a wedding, for example, we often use the passage from 1 Corinthians, where the Apostle Paul says that without love we are nothing, only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal, as Paul puts it. John says, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love, says John. And one of the most famous verses in the whole Bible is John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son. So love is a really important theme that runs through the whole Bible. But when the Bible talks about love, it's not just referring to a bubbly, tingly feeling inside when we find somebody that we like. The Bible talks about a much deeper love, an unconditional and often sacrificial love that doesn't rely on circumstances and doesn't look for any reward. That's the kind of love that Jesus had, and it's the kind of love that he encouraged his followers to have too. Jesus once said to his disciples, "A new command I give you, love each other as I have loved you." I get the impression sometimes reading the Gospels that the disciples didn't always get on that well. They often struggled to get on with one another. They squabbled and they argued, and Jesus often had to remind them that they needed to work together and they needed to love each other. But as God's people, we are called not only to love those within the church, but we're also called to love those outside of the church too. And one story that Jesus told illustrates this point really well. I'm sure it's a story that you know really well. It's from Luke chapter 10. And I shall read it to you. It says, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbour? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down that same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he travelled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave it to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these do you think was a neighbour to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. The It's a good story, isn't it? That challenges us to show love to others. I think during this last year, we've seen a tremendous outpouring of love, like we've never seen before. Much love has been shown for our NHS and key workers. We've clapped for our carers on the doorstep, and rainbows have appeared in people's windows in gratitude for all that the NHS have done this year. There have been lots of acts of kindness, neighbours asking how people are, people going to fetch prescriptions for one another and get shopping and that kind of thing. And communities have come together to help those in need. Food banks have popped up all over the country, and I've been really privileged to be part of the food bank here in Hayes. We have an incredible team of volunteers, but I think what's really humbled us most is the generosity of the community of Hayes. Every week we have a tremendous amount of donations given, and it's really humbling to see the love and care that the community has for their neighbours. So this year we've really seen people loving their neighbour. I think in some ways the tragedy of COVID-19 and the virus that spread has somehow brought the best out of us in some ways. The community has pulled together to love one another. But some of these issues were there long before COVID. So why didn't we always do this? What holds us back from loving people the way that Jesus did? Well, I think the characters in Jesus' story of the Good Samaritan highlight some of the reasons why we might not always love people the way that we ought to. First of all, there was the priest, the person who you'd expect to help, but didn't. Now, you might be a bit shocked that the priest didn't stop to help, but actually, the priest in the story had a good reason not to stop and help. You see, every Jew was taught that to help a person in need was what you ought to do. That's part of the Jewish faith. But there are also strict Jewish laws in how to stay ceremonially clean. For example, in the book of Numbers it says, whoever touches a human corpse will be unclean for 7 days. So in the priest position, if he stopped and helped the injured man who was left half dead, then the priest could be made ritually impure by doing that. And that would put his temple service at risk. It might well be that he couldn't serve in the temple for a week or more. So the position of being a priest might have actually got in the way of the priest stopping to help. Sounds strange, doesn't it? But it reminds me of a time in my last church when we had a team of builders working. They were building a new manse, a new minister's house, on the church grounds. And one day I was talking to their manager about some of the things that weren't quite right. Now, he had the skills to do the job, but he explained to me that he was a manager now. And he showed me his hands. And he said to me, you see these hands? He said, the only time these get dirty now is if I fall over. Perhaps you know some people like that. You see, just like the priest in Jesus' story, his position had stopped him from getting involved. Now think about how different that is to the attitude that Jesus had. They called him Rabbi, and he was a great teacher who had many disciples who followed him. But Jesus never let his position get in the way of doing what was right. Jesus was hands-on, bringing healing and love to so many people. So it's a challenge to those of us who are in ministry. Of course we want to deliver a good sermon on a Sunday. Of course we want to have good teaching. You can tell me how I'm doing with that. But we shouldn't get so fixated on that we neglect to help those in need or to minister to those who need to know God's love. A few weeks ago, Pete Gregg posted on Twitter, for those of us seeking to lead in this difficult season, let's remember that the call to pastor is not to perform or to preach or to manage programs. The call to pastor is to bind up broken hearts, and above all, it's a call to pray diligently for those entrusted to our care. Secondly, we come to the Levite in the story. The Levite was another important role in the temple. Levites were kind of assistant priests. They were the doers in the temple. They manned the temple gates, like security if you like. They cleaned the temple. They slaughtered the animals that were brought for sacrifice. And they were the worship leaders in the temple. So the Levite in Jesus' story was a busy man, busy doing the Lord's work. He hadn't got time to stop and help, not today. You know, sometimes we can be so busy doing the work of God that we don't have time to do the work of God. I remember when I was a student minister, I prayed really hard that someone would come to faith and want to be baptised. We were a Baptist church. I prayed for months, and then one Sunday, one of our young people came up to me and she said that she would like to be baptised. Well, I was over the moon. Finally, someone wanted to be baptised. And then she said to me, "I've been wanting to ask you for weeks, but you always seem so busy." That taught me a really good lesson. If we're always rushing around doing, then we might miss the opportunities. You know, many churches are so busy with their activities and outreach events that they don't have time to take on the big missional works that God would really like the church to be involved in. I think that's the reason that we hadn't started the food bank before. We simply hadn't got time for it. We've been so busy with our other activities. But this year, stopping those activities has given us space. And we've thought about what the community really needs. And the food bank has made a real difference to so many people across Hayes who need to know God's love at this time. Thirdly, we come to the Samaritan, who is a demonstration of how we should all show love to others. But Jesus' Jewish audience would not have only been challenged by this because this man helped whereas others didn't. They would have been especially challenged because the man who stopped to help was a Samaritan. Samaria was an area between Jerusalem and Jericho, and Jews and Samaritans did not get on. In fact, they hated each other. So when Jesus told this story about a Jew travelling through Samaria, most would have probably said, "Why on earth did he travel that way?" They hated Samaritans so much that they would often take a much longer route to avoid travelling through Samaria. But as Jesus often did in his parables, he challenged their prejudice. Perhaps there's people that you struggle to love. Perhaps there's people that sometimes we feel don't deserve to be loved. But Jesus didn't just teach about loving others, he put those words into action too. Jesus often loved those who others found hard to love. He reached out to the outcasts and the so-called sinners. One of his disciples was a tax collector who people hated. One of his closest friends was a prostitute. And Jesus showed love to his enemies too. When Roman soldiers came to arrest him, Peter, who was one of Jesus' disciples, cut off the soldier's ear to fend for Jesus. But Jesus healed that soldier and he went with them to be arrested. And when they nailed him to a cross, Jesus looked at those who had insulted him, who had spat at him, who had beaten him, and who had hammered nails into his hands and feet. And he said, "Father, forgive them." Quite an example for us to follow, isn't it? The Samaritan in Jesus' story showed love to his traditional enemy. He went out of his way to help, and even gave generously to ensure that this man who had been injured was cared for and loved. It's only a story, but Jesus gave it as a challenge for us to be like this Samaritan, to not let our prejudices get in the way of loving others, to not be too busy that we don't have time to help, and to not let our position or our status get in the way either. Paul said to the Colossians, "Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, with kindness, humility, gentleness and patience. And over all of these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. So I hope today you feel loved. I pray that you will know God's love for you. And I pray that we will all get our hands dirty and share God's love as widely as we possibly can. Until next time, God bless you all.